Being from Portugal, do you draw inspiration from Portuguese history, culture, or folklore in your games? Are there any unique Portuguese fables that could be used this way?
Yes.
You have been using it a lot, probably.
But not exactly in the way that. So I was reading the
not necessarily
question.
In fantasy or folklore, but we have used it.
Yes, we used a mix. So we used a lot of story, of course, in the real facts.
Yes, several times. The Sisters of the Seven Sins takes place in Portugal in the 1970s. Well, it's recent history, but it's still history. Then there's All Bets Are Off takes place in Lisbon of the future, but I use the things from the past. Subumbra takes place in Portugal in the 90s, and I used history because it involves the Templars, and Portugal is one of those places.
Then, of course, Sister Pride, that is the kind of continuation for the Sister of the Seven Sins, takes place of Portugal in the 90s, and I used real things that happened in the time. Actually, the story is of the murder is inspired on a real murder, the only serial killer that we had. Then you have I don't remember the name of that adventure, the one that has based on Aleister Crowley and In the Mouth of Hell. I was going to call it From Hell, but I knew it was not From Hell.
In the Mouth of Hell, which is about a real story when Aleister Crowley, when it was in Portugal, meeting Fernando Pessoa, and the fake is on that.
In Hell's Mouth.
In the place called Hell's Mouth, which is it's near the beach. It's just a rock.
Then I actually used one of our adventures for Bastard. The Goat Lady is inspired. Inspired in a folk tale.
And I think we have used other folk tales, but just for plot hooks and some smaller things.
We use a lot. Just real.
Sometimes they are this guy.
Story, yes. Sometimes they're not very. Even films, Portuguese films.
There were also Portuguese films mentioned in Sisters of the Seven Sins, and there's a reference that nobody got.
Let me pick up the crazy cat.
In Welcome to St. Cloud, there's a reference, several references to a book I really love, and I would like to have an English translation of it to recommend to people, but there's not. I'm talking about the Disney. So that's. And I think I probably mentioned I've made references in other places.
What is really funny is that before we were writing things for foreigners, the idea we also have for Start of the Dead. The idea of playing a campaign that would set in Portugal sounded ridiculous.
That one is inspired by a thing that
an awful TV show.
Very absurd TV show. I think it's vaguely inspired by Miami Vice.
Very inspired.
Very vaguely, yes.
It's called Security Man, and it's about two guys that are the securities in a summer resort.
A very fat guy with a beer belly and
that looks like a trucker.
Yeah, he has a trucker hat. Well, anyway, we have really used quite a lot of things, and
we'll continue using it.
Yes, and we will continue using it, especially the ones that aren't obvious.
I think most of them are.
When Pandit did a review of New Flash, he probably found some references to Portugal because he was making fun of that. That we had talked about Portugal in the future being something like. Oh yeah, I know, because there's a timeline there. Yeah, that's probably what he saw. There weren't many references.
But there's a connection because there's actually some.
There are historical connections because that's the place where Avalidad stands is Tangier, and it was once a part of Portuguese Empire.
Well, something that I would like to do maybe one day is to take Lusíadas, so it's a Portuguese epic poem, and try to transform it somehow into an adventure, maybe for space. I don't know, not historical, because that would be boring to do it actually as an historical, but I'd like to find a way to adapt that to space.
Yes, we have talked about that. That's something I like the idea, but I wouldn't like to do it. I have an unwritten book. Well, I started already, but that will be a small setting for Epoch, but instead of Paris, in Lisbon.
I think it works because, well, at least we are using stories that people don't know here. And
the only problem there is that Portuguese literature doesn't have enough genre literature that you can adapt. There's no there's not much thrillers or horror stories.
There's no fantasy,
no fantasy.
No science fiction.
Some new stuff, but that's just by bad writers. But there are some things from classic writers that we could adapt, and we will adapt eventually.
Yeah, and we probably will have to continue to have some adventures taking place in Portugal. Because I think sometimes it's funny to write.
Yeah,
but they're always going to be a bit comical.
Maybe, yeah, that's it. Because when we place something in Portugal, we tend to make it funny because that's how we can. That's how we can relate to that. Only way. That's why we never did when we were just players. We never placed stuff in Portugal because that's related to the fact that Portuguese cinema and literature don't have. You don't have crime mysteries, you don't have horror stories, you don't have fantasy stories. You just have boring daily stuff and obviously very good books, but they aren't adaptable to this. So when we think about doing a police or crime story set in Lisbon, no. I was
gonna say there was
funny. It's just
there was a Portuguese movie director that said that any movie about crime, right? It was about in taking place in Portugal would have to be a comedy.
And I agree with the director. I can't remember who said it, but yeah, I entirely agree.
It couldn't be a serious
one.
It had to have a comedy.
The only thing, and we also based stuff on that one. The only thing that I found. That I've seen in Portuguese production that was kind of it wasn't entirely comic, it was serious at some times, was Zegat.
Yeah, and that one was also a bit light. Not all. Yeah,
it was light, but it wasn't actually a comedy, and it did work because it wasn't a comedy, but it was very wretched. So you see that the cop at the car was falling apart and. Well, that was realistic in that.
Even the bad guys, everybody's wretched.
Yeah, everybody was wretched there, and they were always complaining about the conditions and all that. So that was a realistic police story taking place in Portugal, but it's not very interesting unless you are Portuguese. You couldn't put that on Netflix; people wouldn't like it. So that's it. There's no way to do a Portuguese-based stuff. Unless it's comedy or unless you change it.
If it's historical, if you do something,
or you change it.
Just be different.
Yeah, in that way it could work. For example, folklore, folk tales could work, and they have worked already. We have done that, and we'll do probably again. Okay, that's it. That's over.